presenters now who have traveled here to TZ to be with us. We're going to begin with the renowned Shaykh Abdallah Bin Bayyah from Mauritania, who's now residing in Saudi Arabia, where he is a scholar at the King Abdul Aziz University. Shaykh Bin Bayyah is founder and president of the Organization of Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, and has been a vocal advocate against violent extremism couched in Islamic terms. His efforts recognized most recently by President Obama in his speech at the UN General Assembly this week. Translating for Shaykh Bin Bayyah is Hamza Yusuf of Zaytina College. Shaykh Bin Bayyah.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وصل على سيدنا محمد وعلى إخوانه من النبيين والمرسلين. أيها السيدة الفاضلة، أيها الأخوات سيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
My distinguished introducer and all of the distinguished guests, peace be upon you.
أولا أشكر وزارة الخارجية الفنلندية التي قامت على هذا العمل، وأشكر مركز السلام، المعهد السلام الأمريكي الذي نظم هذه الاجتماعات على
The first thing he wanted to thank the Ministry of Exterior from Finland and also this Institute of Peace for bringing about this forum, important forum.
السؤال الكبير هو إسهام رجال الدين في السلام. قضية السلام هي تحد للبشرية منذ وجد الإنسان على الأرض. كان من مشكلاته الكبرى السلام، لأن البحث عن الثروة وعن القوة هو من طبيعة الإنسان، فكان هذا سببا للحروب. جاءت الأديان والفلاسفة والأخلاقيون والعقلاء لإيجاد حل لهذه المشكلة، لمشكلة الحرب في قلوب الناس، مشكلة الاعتداء، مشكلة القتل. من عهد آدم، من عهد ابني آدم المعروفين قابل وهابل، بدأت المأساة. في كل زمن فيه تحديات. تفضل.
No. So he said that the big question that we're addressing is the role of religious leaders in terms of addressing the problem of violence and extremism. And he said that violence has been a human challenge from the very beginning of our species. We know that human beings have a need for resources, and so sometimes that need actually confronts other people's needs, and so people clash over resources, and this ends up in this violence. And so we've had in history religious leaders and then philosophers, people of intellect that have attempted to address this problem at a deep level, so that they could help solve this problem and bring about peace. And he said that this is a problem that resides in the hearts of people, this problem of violence and extremism. And he said in our foundational story that we have about the first people, we have the story of Cain and Abel. And this is a story of violence. And so it's at the root of the human condition.
فرجال الدين هم في هذا السياق عليهم مسؤولية خاصة هي مسؤولية الطبيب الذي يعالج المجتمع المريض. يقول أحد الفلاسفة أحسبه نيتشه يقول إن الحضارة تمرض وأطباؤها هم الفلاسفة. إذن المجتمعات الآن والحضارة وبخاصة في الشرق الأوسط مريضة. ما هو رد الفعل الذي يجب أن يقوم به رجال الدين؟ هم ليسوا قادة عسكريين لينزلوا إلى الميدان لإيقاف الحروب. هم ليسوا قادة سياسيين.
So he said that in this context, there's a huge responsibility that religious leadership has. It's the responsibility of a physician, really, because if you look at our civilizations, particularly now we see in the Middle East that they're not well, they're sick. And he said that a philosopher, I believe it was Nietzsche, said that civilizations become sick, and the treatment plan has to be at the hands of philosophers and yeah. He said, I think it's Nietzsche who said that. So he said that that the illness has to be addressed by people of intellect.
فقلت يعني فننظر إلى دور رجال الدين في هذا. يبدون في الفقرة لم تترجمها وهي أنهم ليسوا قادة جيوش.
نعم. So he noticed I didn't translate something. So he's very fluent in French, and he follows my translations. But he said that the religious leadership are not military leaders. They don't have the capacity to go in as a military force and stop these conflicts.
ليسوا قادة سياسيين أيضا لاتخاذ إجراءات سياسية ترضي الناخبين.
And he said that they're also not political leaders that can take political decisions that please or otherwise their political constituents.
ليسوا لهم ناخبين هم.
He said they don't have people that elect them into power.
وناس يتصرفون طبقا لقناعات أخلاقية ودينية.
He said these are people that what emanates from them is based on their spiritual and their ethical positions.
وكما قالت الأخت التي تكلمت قبل قليل قد يكونون في ظروف صعبة لكنهم مع ذلك يناضلون من أجل السلام.
And he said, like that was said by the previous speaker, that sometimes they're in incredibly difficult conditions, and yet despite those conditions they rise to the occasion and do what they can.
فهنا ننظر ما هو العلاج الذي يمكن أن يقدمه رجال الدين.
So here we have to look at what is this treatment that we can put forward from the religious leadership in order to treat this problem.
إنه علاج يتوجه إلى العقول والقلوب والعواطف.
He said primarily this is a treatment that addresses the intellects, the hearts, and the emotions.
مقاربتنا هي أن نعلم الناس.
Our approach is to teach people.
هناك مثل إفريقي.
We have an African proverb.
يقول إذا وجدت القرد مريضا بسبب دقيق أو ثمر الدقل، يعني نوع شجرة في إفريقيا، باو يعني شجرة في إفريقيا. وإذا أردت أن يشفى فزده من هذه الشجرة.
He said we have an African proverb. There's a monkey that eats a fruit from the baobab tree, and the fruit makes it sick. But the treatment is to give it more of the same fruit.
فنحن أيضا نزيد الناس نعلمهم الدين زيادة.
So he said that the treatment here is not less religion, but actually more that they need to better understand their faith.
لأننا نشعر أن عند هؤلاء جهل أن عند هؤلاء جهل في الدين.
Because these people actually, it's out of religious ignorance that they're doing what they're doing.
فمعرفتهم سطحية.
They have very shallow understanding.
يستنشدون ببعض النصوص الدينية.
They use some decontextualized verses and things from religious texts.
وبعض التأويلات والتفسيرات.
And their own interpretations and explanations.
وبعض الأمثلة في التاريخ.
And also some historical examples.
هو بناء نحاول أن نفككه.
So this is really an edifice that we need to deconstruct.
هو تيار عنف.
It's this current of violence.
نحاول أن نبني تيارا يواجه هذا التيار.
So we have to build that which will confront this current.
أن نقدم كل المقولات وكل المفاهيم
and put
التي تهيئ السلام.
So we have to put forward intelligent responses and correct understandings that will address the problems.
نحن قد لا نستطيع أن نقول لماذا. الأخت قبل قليل تكلمت عن لماذا وقالت فيه مظلوميات فيه فقر فيه كذا. هذا صحيح، لكن نحن نحاول أن نجيب على كيف مباشرة، أي كيف نعالج مثل الذي يطفئ الحريق، لكن نهتم بلماذا أيضا.
So at this stage he feels that the why is not what needs to be addressed in the immediate circumstances. That, as the previous speaker mentioned, that there are conditions that bring about these problems, but right now the focus should be on how to address the immediate problems. It doesn't mean that we neglect the why. The why is important, but in the immediate circumstances it has to be how do we address this, not why did it come about.
نحن طبعا نطرح الأسئلة الثلاثة وهي ماذا، لماذا، كيف.
And so we always put forward in our methodology 3 questions: what, why, and how.
لكن نبدأ بكيف.
But we begin with how.
ليس معناها أن نهمل البقية.
It doesn't mean we neglect the other 2.
لكن نحاول إطفاء الحريق حتى نرجع على لماذا.
We have a fire that we need to attempt to put it out before we can get into the causes of the fire and who started it.
لأن قد لا يكون بإمكاننا أن نستجيب للأسباب.
Sometimes the problems are too complicated and when we can't even really get to the actual whys.
مظلوميات، فقر.
There's victimization, there's grievances, poverty.
Yes, thank you. لكن نحاول أن نقدم فرصة السلام لتكون مناسبة لحل تلك المشكلة.
But we want to put forward the opportunity of peace because the opportunity of peace is the appropriate environment that we can address these other issues.
وهذا موضوع نقاش كبير بين المفكرين في العالم الإسلامي.
This is a big area of debate amongst intellectuals in the Muslim world.
يقولون كيف تتكلم عن السلام ولا تتكلم عن المظالم.
They said, how can you talk about peace and you're not addressing the grievances?
أنا أقول أن الحرب لن تؤدي إلى حل المظالم.
My perspective is that war is not what is going to solve the problem of the grievances.
لأن الوسائل المستعملة في الحروب الآن وسائل مبيدة للبشر.
He said that now the means by which people engage in war is very different from the previous period. These are weapons of mass destruction and much more destructive.
ولهذا نقول دعونا نصل إلى الأسباب إلى حل المظلوميات أن نصل إليه بوسائل أخرى.
We have to address the grievances by other means.
كانت كان قال إنه إذا لم تكن العدالة فلا يكون السلام في كتابه عن السلام الدائم.
In Perpetual Peace, Kant talks about that without
الفيلسوف كانت.
the philosopher Kant talks about without justice there can be no peace, which is a very common slogan people hear.
هذا صحيح ليكون سلام كامل.
He said that's true. You can't have Kant or Kamel.
كانت.
You can't have Kantian peace.
ليكون سلاما كاملا.
Kamilan, sorry.
Okay.
You can't have complete peace. It's close, Kamel Kant.
لكن أفضل أن يكون سلاما، أن يوجد هدوء حتى نحل المشاكل بعقل.
But it's more important from his perspective to have peace so that we can address the problems of justice within the context of peace.
أن يوجد حوار مجتمعي.
We need the dialogue of civilizations.
حوار مجتمعي.
A societal dialogue.
نعم. يشترك فيه رجال الدين مع الشباب مع النساء مع الجميع. حوار مجتمعي.
This has to be the whole society has to engage in this dialogue. The men, the women, the youth, the religious leadership, political leadership.
للبحث عن بدائل الحرب.
So that we can really examine the alternatives to war.
كما يقول أفلاطون يقول إن الحوار هو الذي يقدم البدائل المختلفة عن الحرب، وإن الحرب هي دليل على فشل الحضارة.
That Plato said that the dialogue is the means by which we find alternatives to war, and that war is actually the failure of a civilization.
أفلاطون.
نعم.
لهذا فمقاربتنا قد تكون معقدة، قد تكون طويلة الأمد، لكن إذا وصلنا إلى إقناع الكثير من الناس بهذه المقاربة يمكن أن نهيئ أرضية للسلام.
So our approach might appear to be complex. It also might appear to be a long-term approach, but if enough people are convinced of this approach, then we can work towards engendering peace.
نحن نعتقد أن الديانات ودين الإسلام الذي يتكلم باسمه فيها أساس كبير للسلام.
He said, I believe that all of our religions, but in particular the religion that I speak on behalf of, Islam, has within it mechanisms for promoting peace.
ولكن هنا أريد أن أنبه على شيء.
But I want to draw attention to a point.
هو أن السلام أن الأديان كالطاقة.
Religion is like a power.
Energy,
power.
طاقة.
Energy.
ليس power، يعني ليس قوة وإنما أليس كذلك؟
نعم صحيح.
أن السلام أن الأديان كالطاقة.
It's an energy.
هذه الطاقة يمكن أن تصنع بها المياه والحدائق الخضراء وكل شيء، تصنع بها الازدهار.
So you can use that energy to facilitate the water and bring about life and bring about agriculture and greenery.
كما يمكن أن تصنع بها القنابل المبيدة للبشر.
But you can also use that same energy to develop weapons of mass destruction that can annihilate us.
هذه حالة الأديان يجب أن نعترف بذلك.
He said this is exactly the problem with our religions.
فالإنسان الذي يحمل الدين هو المسؤول عن هذه الصناعة.
So the people that carry the religion, they're responsible for how they use this energy.
لهذا فمقاربتنا تقوم على إيضاح كل أسس السلام في الدين الإسلامي.
نعم.
فمقاربتنا.
So our approach is to use all of these means within our religious tradition to promote peace.
وتفنيد كل الآراء التي يتذرع بها الآخرون لتقديم وسائل الحرب.
And also to reveal the sophistical nature of these arguments that people are using for the opposite approach.
بما فيها تلك الذرائع التي قد تكون مفتراه ليست موجودة.
Sometimes they use means that are actually just completely fabricated, that have no real basis or source.
أضرب لهم مثلا عقدنا مؤتمرا قبل 5 سنوات.
Just to give you an example, we had a conference 5 years ago.
حول فتوى لأحد العلماء في القرن السابع الهجري أي قبل 7 قرون.
We have a fatwa from somebody who's from the 8th century.
هذا العالم اسمه الشيخ ابن تيمية.
His name was Ibn Taymiyya.
هذه الفتوى اعتمد عليها مجموعة الجهاد في مصر عبد السلام فرج في كتاب له ليقولوا إنه يجوز قتل كل المصريين يعني باعتبار الدار دار حرب.
So this fatwa was used by, there was a ideologue in Egypt, Abdul Salam Faraj, who actually used this fatwa as a foundation for a small book that he wrote, arguing that Muslims and Muslim rulers in Egypt could be killed because they weren't following the Sharia.
وقتلوا السادات على أساسها.
And Sadat was assassinated based on this fatwa.
هذه الفتوى هي فتوى محرفة منذ 100 سنة.
And this fatwa was actually, the fatwa had a misprint in it because of a printing of over 100 years ago. There was actually a misprint in the fatwa that came out. And this fatwa was also quoted by Al-Qaeda in their declarations over 150 times.
منذ 100 سنة حرفت الفتوى في طبعتين، طبعة القاهرة وطبعة الرياض.
So there were 2 editions, one in Riyadh and one in Cairo, and both editions had this mistake.
أنا قلت ابن تيمية لم يقل هذا.
So when I heard the fatwa when we were addressing the issue in Mardin in Turkey, which is where the people who asked him for the fatwa were
العلماء في ماردين في تركيا.
I brought together a group of scholars just to discuss the fatwa, but during that discussion I looked at it and realized that there was a problem with the fatwa and actually said there's something wrong. I don't think Ibn Taymiyyah said this.
وأخذنا النسخة القلمية المخطوطة التي توجد في الظاهرية في دمشق.
So when we got back to Jeddah, we actually asked somebody from Syria in Damascus, and there's a maktaba, a library there that's known to have some of the oldest manuscripts. We got one of the oldest manuscripts,
الوحيد.
and it was the only one.
وجدنا ما قلته صحيح.
And we found that what I had pointed out on the misprint was actually accurate. That in the original handwritten manuscript, it had a completely different word.
فاتفق العلماء جميعا على أن هذه الفتوى كانت محرفة.
So we showed, and then everybody agreed, even though they didn't agree at the time, I'm adding that, but everybody agreed later that the fatwa was indeed misquoted. It was a misprint because the actual word, it said yuqatal, which means, that the ruler could be killed or fought or you attempt to kill him, whereas the actual word was yu'amal, that he should be treated appropriately, which is a completely different understanding.
هذا مثال صغير.
He said this is a small example.
المهم أن نكون مجموعة كبيرة جيشا من العلماء. جيشا ليس محاربا. نحن الحرب التي نقولها هي حرب سلاح.
He said we really need to have an army of scholars, and I'm not saying an army, I'm using that metaphorically. We need an army of scholars that can address these issues.
لبث هذه الأفكار.
In order to disseminate these ideas.
نحتاج إلى فضاءات.
We need spaces
لنبث في هذا الفكر.
Where these ideas can be disseminated.
العلماء يحتاجون إلى حماية.
The scholars, they need also security protection because they're being assassinated.
علماء في نيجيريا، في الصومال، في سوريا اعتدي عليهم.
Libya, that's Libya.
في ليبيا نعم.
So in these places like Somalia, Nigeria, Libya, Syria, many places, Yemen, that the scholars that are speaking out now against these positions, they're actually putting their lives into jeopardy, including the Shaykh.
يجب أن يوجد تعاون بين العلماء وبين السلطات العاقلة.
So there has to be some type of cooperation between the scholars and between the peoples in authority, the intelligent people in authority to do that.
ليس معنى ذلك أن العلماء سيقولون ما تقوله الحكومات.
And that can't mean that the scholars just say what is pleasing to the governments.
ولكن هناك قدر مشترك.
But there has to be some agreed upon area where they can work
هو
together.
السلام.
And that's peace.
هذا الذي نسعى إليه.
This is what we're engaged in endeavoring to do.
وقد التقينا بعلماء من نيجيريا.
We met with scholars from Nigeria.
عقدنا اجتماع يومين حول هذا الوضع. التقينا بعلماء من الصومال قبل ذلك.
We had a gathering for 2 days, and then we also had a forum with the scholars from Somalia.
التقينا بعلماء من كل أنحاء العالم في مؤتمرنا الأخير.
And then in the recent forum, we brought together 250 scholars from all over the world to address
ووافقوا على بيان السلام.
the issue of peace, and they agreed upon the declaration that we put forward, and that declaration is online.
ليست عندنا قنوات إعلامية.
We don't have the media channels.
ليست عندنا إمكانات الانتشار في العالم.
We don't have the capability to spread these things around the world.
لكن مع ذلك سنحاول.
But despite all of that, we'll continue to do what we can.
وشكرا. والسلام عليكم.
Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا جزيلا for your insights and for your courage, Shaykh Bin Bayyah.
أشكركم على هذه النقاط وكذلك لشجاعتك.
And I hope our friends at Google and Facebook and YouTube were all listening to that last part in particular about the need to work with technologists to spread this message far.
في جوجل ويوتيوب وهذه الأماكن يعني يستمعون لهذا الكلام.
Our next speaker, Pastor Esther Ibanga, unfortunately couldn't be here with us today because of some travel difficulties. But we didn't want to lose her voice and her insights in our discussion, given her remarkable and courageous work she's doing on the ground in Nigeria as president of Women Without Walls Initiative in Jos, Nigeria, which is a place in Nigeria which has witnessed quite a bit of violence between militant Christian and Muslim extremist groups. So she kindly shot a video presentation for us to air today. I could ask my friends in back to please screen it.
Hello there, I'm Pastor Esther Ibanga, and I pastor Just Christian Missions International here in Nigeria, and it's a privilege to be part of this conversation. I'm sure it's been a great meeting. It's a pity I'm missing it, but well, we hope next time it works out. The nature of extremism in my own context that I understand, having worked as a religious leader in my own community and in my own state and country, is that you have someone who believes his opinion is superior to any other, you know, and as such you are naturally would be intolerant to any other opinion that's not, you know, similar to your own opinion. And the nature of such extreme either opinion or ideologies or whatever it is, you know, that makes people be extremely passionate about what they believe in and how things must be done. The nature of such stand is that it always looks for ways of expression. Now, I'm not saying that it all the time leads to terrorism, but the fact that, you know, you have such extremist views on a particular issue, naturally it's like a bottled up, you know, pent up, you know, a bottle of Coke under the sun, and the moment that cork is lifted up, it just bursts out. So there's very little that triggers such, you know, opinions. And most of these extremist views can be destructive. They are exclusive in nature, and they claim to have superior knowledge. They're standing on something else that no one else knows, and their opinion is better than anybody's, and of course that naturally will lead them to absolute intolerance of any other opinion that contradicts their opinion. So basically we're talking about how that affects, you know, family units and then the society at large. It is very important that we also address the issue of injustice. You know, most extremist views have a feeling that you know, they have not been given fairness, and so there's a sense of injustice that justifies whatever that extremist views now results in. And so that sense of injustice needs to be addressed. And I must say that as religious actors, we really do have a challenge, particularly female religious leaders, because you'll be surprised that even in the religious circle, first of all, there is very little platform for example, women that can participate and actually have their voices heard. It's a male-dominated area, even in religion. Most religions do not believe a woman should actually speak. So it's actually a challenge for a voice, or the voice of a woman, to speak strongly on the issue of extremism. And I also think that one of the challenges we face as religious leaders is the fact that you can only counsel them and you can pray for them, but you can't force them. So if somebody is holding so strongly to an opinion or a view, you know, you can only counsel. You can only try to make the person see the other way, but you can't force them. Some of them are actually born with that belief system. So, you know, there's only so much you can do. And like I mentioned about the strong male voices, I really think that platforms should be created for more female voices. Number one, their mothers, their sisters, their daughters. There's a way a woman perceives and ministers that's different from a man. And I also think that outsiders can help by creating more platforms where religious actors are actually involved in decision-making process. That is really, really important. When policies are formed and made, you know, religious leaders are totally exempted from it because they feel that it is totally outside the mosque or the church. But I also think that they need the input, so to speak, the guidance from a spiritual perspective. We're all spiritual beings as it is. And in the long run, there are principles that guide us. The Bible guides every Christian in the way he or she lives. And I think that even on a government level, when policies are being made, religious actors should actually be included, you know, to offer, you know, guidance as to how some of these laws, because if you look at the Bible, most of the laws in our Constitution is even taken from there. And everybody believes thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not steal, and so on and so forth. So where there is a common ground, I think that that should be utilized. And I also think that in the place of you know, resolving conflicts and talking about reconciliation and things like that, it's very important to involve religious actors. You may not always have that influence outside of the church or the mosque, but to the level of influence that you have within the church and the mosque, it should be adequately utilized. How outsiders can help religious actors? Well, they can support them, you know, and in the place of training, and in both religions, I think, and also being exposed to different platforms to enable them and equip them and empower religious actors to make use of the influence they have over followers. positively, more positively. And I think that also religious actors should also be examined, on their own to make sure that they don't hold extremist views, because, you give out what you have, and if you're already an extremist yourself as a religious leader, then you're not likely to, encourage tolerance and acceptance of the differences from other people. So I think that the government can help, the society can help, and in recognizing the role of religious leaders in actually influencing the lives of their followers positively. And I think that that should not be taken lightly at all. Well, these are just my views, and I hope that you have a great meeting. I look forward to hearing the rest of this conference, and have a great time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Our final speaker is a dear and old friend of mine, Vinaya Aryaratna from the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka. Sarvodaya is a Buddhist faith-based organization that's guided by Gandhian principles of nonviolence, promotes poverty eradication and peace across ethnic and religious divisions. And Sarvodaya has sought to empower religious actors to serve as agents of peace and coexistence in the country, particularly in the midst of multiple forms of violence. Dr. Vinaya is a doctor by training, but a peace activist at heart and by practice. Vinaya.
Thank you, Susan. Shaykh Bin Bayyah, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply honored and very humbled to be a part of this distinguished panel. I speak as a lay Buddhist, a practitioner who is connected to the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement of Sri Lanka, which is by far the most widespread grassroots development organization in the country, which is based on Buddhist and Gandhian principles, as mentioned by Susan. We work across all ethnic and religious communities in the country, and we have a history of working in Sri Lanka for more than 50 years now. Sri Lanka is a country which is now emerging out of a very violent conflict which lasted for more than 30 years. And today, though the war is not there anymore, we are trying to rebuild our country, which is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. And we have also experienced violent extremism in Sri Lanka during the last 3 to 4 decades. The more prominent one has, of course, been the ethnic strife that had affected our country for nearly 3 decades. But there were also other insurrections, youth insurrections, very violent insurrections, twice in our history, which had also claimed the lives of hundreds and thousands of youth who belonged to both ethnic communities. Now, I would say that religion played an insignificant role in those conflicts compared to what some of the recent trends that we see in our country today. We have seen during the last few years actions by certain Buddhist monks who have taken up a confrontational stand against the Muslim community in Sri Lanka, which is very unfortunate. And this has also resulted in serious riots recently, and where a number of lives were lost, and also significant damage to livelihoods and also to property. It's not my intention to go into a deep analysis of the causes, effects, and possible solutions to the varied forms of violent extremism that we see, or the trends of violent extremism that we see in our country, but to reflect on how ordinary people read this situation and what we are trying to do to promote peace and harmony in our part of the world. I also draw from the experiences that were shared during our deliberations from yesterday with my colleagues who also come from some countries which face similar challenges. Now, ethnic and religious identity really form an integral part of our society, particularly in Asia. Religion has played a very important role in building not only the culture but also social and economic systems. Now, whilst I would call them those religious ethnic determinants or drivers as internal, our deeper consciousness is shaped by our history, the way history is narrated in our textbooks, as we were taught when we were children, and also how today the mass media portray religious and ethnic identity. So in a very highly charged context that we had to operate today compared to maybe 20-30 years ago. This poses a great challenge to multi-ethnic, multi-religious and multicultural societies such as ours in a very increasingly globalizing world. So when it is claimed that Sri Lanka as a Buddhist country, predominantly Buddhist country, but which has all ethnic and religious communities living, and which is now seeing these alarming trends of increased organized violence against certain ethnic groups. But by and large, Sri Lanka has been a model of religious harmony. And if you visit Sri Lanka even today, what you see, what you witness is more of religious coexistence and harmony than animosity. Now, use of ethnic and religious identity to mobilize one's own community against another community has been, in my view, used as a political tool. This has also been emphasized during our discussions from many participants based on their country's experience that religion has been captured or taken over. It has been framed. So it's not really religion which is driving youth and certain groups into extremism, but larger political interests. So this is an important factor we have to consider. Now, how do we address this trend of extremism and radicalization? At the outset, I would like to say that extremism and radicalization cannot be or solely or primarily addressed through a security doctrine only. There are enough examples. Now, in our context, we see three important spheres of influence that are important. One is what we call the psychosocial dimension, and we call it the consciousness. Consciousness is the way how we think collectively as individuals, as communities, on various things that affect our lives. Our identities are formed through this consciousness and this collective psychology and what we have accumulated over the years as part of our culture and values. And it is at this level that the religion and religious actors play a very important role or has the most influence. Then secondly, it has to do with physical needs or what we call economics. In a situation where young people do not see a future for themselves or for their families, and there is fertile ground for external forces to exploit. If people's basic needs are not satisfied, and if there is unequal distribution of wealth, income, and resources, then naturally that's a breeding ground for extremism. This results in a sense of hopelessness, and which combined with the above mentioned psychosocial factors lead to great vulnerability for young people to be attracted to violent extremist ideologies and organizations. Those are not the only two factors. Then thirdly, we have governance or power. We all know that politics is an important driver. When people feel disempowered, disenfranchised sometimes, they cannot take part in the decision-making processes that affect their lives, that lead to deeper frustrations and enhance their vulnerability further. In today's globalized world, local violence is not just driven by local factors. Global policies as well as interpretations of ethno-religious identities may even provide legitimacy to some acts of extreme violence as we see in our part of the world today. We therefore believe that any action to prevent or combat violent extremism should be an integrated, holistic and multi-level approach that addresses psychosocial, economic and political determinants. Now, coming back to our own experience in Sri Lanka, we have been constantly and in a systematic way have attempted to address these issues for several decades, even at time when we were facing a very bloody war. And we have also come up with innovative and sometimes very rapid action to address sudden eruption of violence. Therefore, early warning systems, the religious leaders as well as those secular organizations which can identify these trends of violence early and can act, it will make a huge impact in combating or preventing violence. Now, at the level of consciousness, our work primarily involves facilitating greater understanding of one's own religion. The religion is misinterpreted. Now, Buddhism is a very, very peaceful religion which promotes ahimsa, non-violence in every aspect, thoughts, deeds, and words. However, it has been interpreted by certain groups in a very different way. Therefore, we also have to understand not only our own religion, but how we relate to other religions, particularly in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. So we have been involved in not just education of our own communities, but also relating to other teachings of other religions, and we have researched and published books for children, youth, to learn and understand basic religious teachings of other traditions. Sometimes they are simple storybooks. They have been published in both Sinhala and Tamil languages, the languages that are mostly spoken in Sri Lanka and distributed throughout the country. They have had a tremendous impact of promoting understanding. We also recognize the important role played by the religious leaders themselves and also other religious actors. Interfaith dialogue and understanding has to be promoted. Now, sometimes we are being criticized for promoting interreligious activities. However, if you prepare the religions and religious leaders first to look at their own religions before they have interreligious dialogues, then I think we can have a very big impact. During the last 3 years, we have organized such programs involving hundreds of religious leaders, which include training and capacity building. We see now a disconnect between sometimes the traditional religious leaders and younger generations because they cannot readily relate and interpret the teachings of religions in a way that is relevant to the present day generation's needs and aspirations. So there has to be a certain facilitation to build capacity and to get them to be equipped with certain skills that are required. That may include communication skills, understanding how to use certain types of technologies, how to use multiple sources of references, and so on. So, interreligious committees and councils consisting of Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Christian clergy were formed, and during the recent riots, we have seen that these groups acting together, somehow stopping the spread of violence to other areas, particularly serving as even like firewalls, and it has been so effective. And we think that we can really, on one hand, have primary prevention, that is prevention of extremism emerging in the first place, and at other times trying to detect such trends early and taking early action. And these multi-ethnic, multi-religious councils have been able to effectively stop violence from spreading to many parts of the country when we have witnessed such violence in some isolated locations. So the important driver is really the consciousness, but at the same time we have to also act on the other two spheres, which is economics and governance. Economics also, traditionally our societies have been shaped, even our economies have been shaped by certain principles that are found in our faith traditions. We have Buddhist economics, where are certain principles of sharing, how an economy should be organized around the principle of justice, equality. That is very important. Today, our per capita income as a country is very high. We are a middle income country. We are no longer a poor country, but the income distribution is so skewed that there are so many disparities, and even if you take certain basic indicators such as malnutrition or even infant mortality rate, health and social indicators, the national indicators are very good, but then you see vast disparities between districts and regions. Therefore, it's very important to address inequities, and every religion has certain principles how you should organize your economics, or how systems should be organized at community level to satisfy basic needs of people. We need to have the religious leaders and religious actors reflecting on those economic principles as well, and that can also affect policies. Lastly, the aspect of governance. We all know that we would like to be part of decision making, of decisions that affect our lives. The principle of subsidiarity. Has it been really practiced in our country? Most of the violent groups or the groups of, say, youth who are attracted to extremist groups have felt that they have no part in the decision making. So basic principles of democracy, by way of forming community organizations, get them to be involved, get them to be part of electoral processes, local government elections, promoting dialogue where you can influence policies at multiple levels. Those are important interventions that can also prevent extremism and radicalization. Now, what can religious leaders do in that context? Now, we have formed these smaller groups or committees which are really looking at social issues at a local level, which brings together religious leaders and also representatives of organizations which have a spiritual basis, and that has been very effective. Those have been very effective in expanding the democratic space for various interventions. So finally, what I would like to say is that religion has been used as a tool for division, whereas all religions do not preach division or hatred or violence. Particularly in our society where civilizations have been built on faith-based traditions, we need to do much more. We can't take it for granted anymore. We have to come together, particularly those of us who are working from the civil society organizations with drawing inspiration from great religious traditions. We need to work together. But our local actions can succeed only if external drivers are also promoting harmony and promoting coexistence at ground level. Therefore, those policymakers who are working at international policymaking institutes should also take into consideration that we have to work together in a common framework where we support each other rather than undermining each other's work. I would like to thank the USIP for giving me this opportunity, and I assure you that we all would continue to work at grassroots level. We have to bring bridges. That is why we have many who come from the country, from the grassroots, who are working together, and we have to draw strength from each other, because sometimes even our lives are in danger, because we have to really work with certain forces which do not believe in non-violent conflict resolution or peace building. Thank you very much.
We have about 20 minutes to open it up for question and answer, and I ask that you form lines. There's 2 microphones halfway up the auditorium, so if you can form lines behind them. And while you're doing that, because Syria is so much in the news, I also invited my colleague Hind to say a couple words about the work that's being done with religious actors in Syria as well. And just to warn you guys, our group is going to have to leave. I'm going to have to end this precisely at noon, because our group is going to be going to the Hill for Juma, for Friday prayers. So bear with me if we're not able to get to all of your questions.
I just want to remind you that the Syrian people on the ground today, they're expressing a great confusion in what's happening with the airstrike. So I'm urging everybody to know that we can't have airstrike without social and political solution. And as a Christian Syrian, and part of the Syrian people, we've been working so hard in interfaith activities on the ground with Muslim, Alawite, and Druze everything. And this kind of activities, it would give a great hope for Syria and for the Syrian, that without interfering, without having a conversation and dialogue together, we can achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is collect 4 questions. If you could say your name, say your institution, and then please ask a question, and keep it short if you can, so that we can get to as many as possible. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Ali Mohammed. I'm a student at the American University. I'm an international student from Egypt. My question here is addressed to our distinguished Sheikh. We know that the role of religious leadership is mainly for educating and enlightening the general public. But they also have a role which is advising those in power. But now we have a very serious issue, which is a lot of the religious scholars stand side by those dictators and undemocratic regimes. So how can our scholars, restore their credibility and the trust of the people in their ability to make a difference and promote peace? Because we want them to discuss the very causes of the issue, which is extremism. A lot of youth nowadays, especially in the Middle East, they don't have a chance to be part of the decision-making process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we collect 2 more questions and then we'll... Please go ahead. It should be on if you just speak into it.
Hi, thank you. My name is Karen Volker, and I'm with an organization called Cure Violence. And we take a health approach to developing the Southeast gun violence that really relies on credible messengers like yourselves setting norms and expectations about violence. So my question to the panel is whether you think it would make a difference if instead of promoting peace and coexistence and the positive thing, it was a much clearer focused message on not doing violence. And in doing so, create more space for those efforts to promote peace and coexistence to have success.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks to USIP for hosting this important issue. My name is Yasser Zaidan. I'm a graduate student in the Institute of World Politics. My question is for Shaykh Bin Bayyah. It has been always an important role for religious leaders in Muslim countries to reform and take deed. But the problem is that there are some religious texts that hasn't been more organized or interpreted. Like some hadith in Sahih that has to be misprinted, as you said, the example of fatwa. Also, such example, the examples that you said about the fatwa of Shaykh Ibn Taymiyya. This is the first time I heard about it. Why it isn't published in a more wider way? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Peter, why don't we do one more? Go ahead.
Yes, Peter Kovac, retired Department of State diplomat and interfaith activist. I can't resist having Shaykh Hamza up there with our 2 distinguished guests, and thanks to USIP for pulling this very important discussion together, asking for a comment on the role of interfaith seminary training in this peace-building capacity. Thank you.
Thank you.
أنا يعني لازم أسأله
هو يسألني عن أهمية
المدارس.
The last question was about interfaith seminary education. Interfaith seminary education, the role that it plays in peace building. You can speak to it.
I think I'll answer the last question. We have been promoting the interfaith dialogue mainly, and also connecting the religious leaders from different faiths to their lay followers. That's a very simple model.
I don't know whether I got it.
That's good. The other questions we had were on the focus on governments, the promotion of non-violence instead of peace, and then
هل نركز على عدم العنف أو نشر السلام؟ يعني فهمت؟ Did you? I mean, she's saying on basically how you frame.
How we frame it.
How we frame it.
Putting the focus on not resorting to violence.
يعني
as opposed to advocating for peace.
نركز على يعني أن لا نستخدم العنف أو أن يعني ننشر السلام.
هو يعني السؤال يضع مقابلة بين شيئين هما متكاملان في حقيقتهما.
He said that the question is really putting two sides of the same scales, that they complete one another.
فعدم العنف هو السلام.
He said not using violence is also peace.
طبعا هناك فيلسوف يقول إن السلام ليس انعدام الحرب وإنما السلام هو الأخوة بين البشر، هو الأخوة التي تقوم في القلوب.
So there's a philosophical opinion though that peace is not simply the absence of war, but rather the fellowship of humanity, that people have in their hearts a sense of human solidarity.
لكن عندما نريد أن نتكلم عن السلام لا بد أن نتكلم أيضا عن إيقاف العنف.
So when we want to speak about peace, we're speaking about it also because we have to speak about ending the violence.
لأن السلام يعني لن يكون سلام وفي نفس الوقت حرب. الحرب هي والسلام لا يمكن أن يكونا معا.
You can't have peace and war together. They're opposites.
صحيح. إذا أمكن أن نوقف أسباب الحرب وأن نزيل أسباب الحرب هذا هو الأساس، هذا أفضل شيء.
The best thing is to remove the causes of war. That's obviously the ideal situation.
هذا أفضل طريق.
And that's the best approach.
لكن إذا لم نستطع فعلى الأقل نحصل على سلام تدريجي، سلام ناقص.
But if we can't do that, then at least we have to get a peace that is incomplete. In other words, it has shortcomings.
ليس مثاليا.
And it's not the ideal situation, and sometimes we have to do that piecemeal.
وليس مثاليا.
It's not the ideal situation.
لكن مع ذلك نحن لا نيأس، علينا دائما أن نتحرك نحو السلام، أن ندعو إلى السلام.
So we shouldn't despair. We have to move towards peace.
في نفس الوقت الذي ندين فيه العنف وندين فيه الظلم.
At the same time, we have to condemn violence. We have to condemn the extremism.
وهذا إجابة على سؤال الأخ الذي قال يعني أن رجال الدين لا يدينون ما تقوم به الحكومات. رجال الدين يدعون إلى الحق وإلى السلام وإلى رفع المظالم.
And that also addresses the question that was raised earlier by the young man about these despotic rulers, that it's a responsibility of religious leadership to speak the truth, to address grievances, to remind people in power of their responsibilities.
يوجد تفاوت طبعا بين رجال الدين في فهم قضية السلام.
So there's obviously levels of understanding amongst religious leadership about this problem of peace.
فمنهم من يقول مثل كانت رجال الدين الإسلامي ككانت أيضا، بعضهم يقول العدالة أولا.
So there's some who say justice first and no peace without justice.
لكن نحن رأينا في مجتمعاتنا أن إذا قلنا العدالة المطلقة أولا مع ارتفاع سقف البطالب إذا لن يوجد سلام.
But from my perspective, if we say in the current conditions no peace without justice, then given the amount of grievances that we're dealing with, let's forget about peace altogether.
فلهذا يجب أن يقوم السلام في القلوب حتى نتحرك نحو العدالة.
So we have to get peace established in our hearts so that we can then work towards addressing the grievances in peaceful environments.
نضع السلاح.
Putting aside the weapons.
كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من حمل علينا السلاح فليس منا.
Our Prophet said, whoever holds up a weapon against us is not among us, not one of us.
Thank you, Shaykh. Shaykh Yusuf, do you want to speak to the Interfaith Seminary?
The Interfaith Seminary. I think one of the crises in the Muslim societies, I mean, I'll give you an example. Shaykh Abdallah Bin Bayyah comes from a tradition that really is over 1,000 years old. And what's really fascinating about his approach is that he's not a modernist. That his approach is actually drawn from these deep sources within the tradition itself. The Ottoman example is a really interesting example because the Ottomans had a multi-faith society that was based on a man, their first ruler, Osman I, who actually had a vision of a massive sycamore tree coming out of his breast. He had a dream where he saw a massive sycamore tree coming out of his breast, and all of the religions were in the shade of that tree. And this was something that the Ottomans were very, very proud of, the fact that they protected all of these religious minorities, that within the traditional Ottoman system, the religious minorities, what was called the millet system, they had their own court systems, the Jews had their own court systems. The Ottomans built synagogues when the Jews were being persecuted in Spain, and Bernard Lewis, a great Jewish scholar from the United States, points this out in his book, that the Ottomans not only invited the Jews to migrate to the Ottoman lands, but they built synagogues for them. And that's why some of the most beautiful synagogues that you'll find in Eastern Europe were built by Ottomans, not by Jews. These sources that we have, the convivencia in Spain, where the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians live together, people forget that during the Muslim rule in Spain, the Muslims never got to over 50%. That they ruled a country that was still a majority of Christians, and the Christian churches were preserved. That the fact that we've lost so many of these communities, this is one of the great scandals of Muslims in human history. What's happening in Syria to these Christians who have been there for 2,000 years. I mean, these are some of the oldest Christian traditions that we have, the Nestorian, the Jacobite, the Malachite traditions. These are ancient Christian traditions. The Malibari Nasranis that are in India, these were ancient Christians that were persecuted by Orthodox Christianity and yet lived in the Muslim world. The icons during the iconoclastic period in the Muslim world, the only icons that we have during the iconoclastic period where the Christians went and burnt all the icons, that was a short period in Orthodox history, but the only icons from that period are from the monasteries that were protected by the Muslims. And so Muslims traditionally understood this, that there was a responsibility toward religious minorities, and this unfortunately is from the massive ignorance the religious ignorance that we have, and that's why Shaykh Abdallah, his argument, Jonathan Swift said we have just enough religion to hate one another and not enough to love one another. That's a very apt truth for our age that we have forgotten, as was pointed out about the axial faiths, that they came in a time of immense immense violence and conflict, and were actually introduced to remove that. Karen Armstrong, in A Prophet for Our Time, about the Prophet Muhammad, argues that his central thrust was to create a peaceful environment on the Arabian Peninsula because there was so much violence and vengeance. So we've fallen back into this what they call the Jahili period. And I think if we don't address the madrasa issue and real enlightened religious leadership in all of our traditions, because we know that we have Jewish extremists that teach a horrible form of Judaism, where people are seen as less than human in the Holy Land. That doesn't represent the great tradition of Rabbi Hillel and other of the great religious enlightened leadership from the Jewish tradition that says the whole foundation of the Torah is to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And everything else is just commentary. And so, and the same with Christian fanaticism and Buddhism, which has a nonviolent PR. But if you study Buddhist tradition and just study what the Buddhists did to the Muslims when they reconquered Afghanistan, I encourage you to read the Claws of Buddha, which is about religious violence within the Buddhist tradition. So Buddhism has a history of violence also. So that all of these religions, like the Sheikh said, they have violence and they have the potential to eliminate violence, and it depends on how we use them.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes, so if we can take these 2 questions, and I'm going to ask a closing question as well.
Thank you. Ali Al-Mawlawi from the Embassy of Iraq. I'd like to ask the distinguished speakers whether they see a difference in terms of root causes between sectarian-based conflicts and conflicts between religions. In other words, should there be a different approach in terms of intrafaith dialogue and interfaith dialogue? Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm Mehreen Farouk from WORD, the World Organization for Resource Development and Education. I wanted to thank all the speakers, especially Shaykh Bin Bayyah, for your excellent comments and particularly your fatwas against violent extremism. Our organization, WORD, has published a number of reports on the importance of engaging religious actors, but often we find that Western governments are hesitant to engage these actors, and they're slow to address the need to build the institutional capacity of religious networks. So my question is, how can we work to overcome and address this challenge?
Thank you. So the first question is on the difference between doing intrafaith and interfaith.
يعني intrafaith يعني بين نفس المنتمين حوار بين مثلا سني شيعي.
Whether the root causes of those conflicts are different and require different avenues to solve.
المقاربة تختلف لما تكون الصراع من داخل الدين نفسه ولما يكون الصراع بين الأديان.
The second was about overcoming the reticence that the Western governments have to engaging with religion.
والسؤال الثاني حول السكوت أو يعني تجنب الحكومات الغربية في استخدام القادة الدينيين في تقديم حلول لهذه المشاكل.
And the final question I would like to add is similar to that. It's some of this reticence I know comes from recognition that Western governments working with embracing some of these actors or Western organizations like the U.S. Institute for Peace doing so can delegitimate them or put them at risk. So my final question too is, what can we do to help without making your life at risk or making your life your work more difficult to achieve?
تحديدات لأمثالكم.
بالنسبة للسؤال الأول.
The first question.
هو مسألة المقاربة، هل تختلف بين الحوار في داخل الدين الواحد أو بين الديانات المختلفة؟
Are the approaches different from when you have inter and intra religious conflict?
هو أولا إذا أخذت خريطة الشرق الأوسط تجدي المشكلات في الدين الواحد. مثلا عندك خط من طهران إلى لبنان إلى اليمن اليوم هو بين الشيعة وبين السنة.
So if you look, for instance, in our region in the Middle East, you have in Iran and then Lebanon and then to Yemen, you have this problem between the Sunni and the Shia.
مرورا بالعراق وبسوريا.
And then you pass through Syria and Iraq.
عندما ننزل غربا طبعا هناك منطقة التي فيها منطقة دولة إسرائيل أيضا هي موجودة هناك.
And then also when you look at Israel, the state of Israel, for example, you have the same problem.
إذا نزلت غربا إلى مصر وإلى ليبيا تجد خلافا في داخل مذهب واحد هو مذهب أهل السنة، لكن بين من لهم فهم خاص أو بالتالي يقولون إنهم يمثلون الدين الحقيقي، وبين مجموعة أخرى لا يمكن أن نقول هي خارج الدين لكن قد تكون لها نظرة في الحياة تختلف.
So in Egypt, for instance, you have a problem of within the Sunni Muslims there, one group says that what they're doing is the right way to the way that a country should be run, and they're saying the other group is wrong in that way. So they have different understandings of how they're.
بعض يقول علمانيين ولا.
So some people use the term secularist and Islamist.
أنا في الحقيقة لا أجد حدودا قوية ظاهرة بين هذا.
I don't really see a real demarcation that's clear to me to make those type demarcations.
فالحقيقة أن المقاربة هي أن نبحث عن حوار جاد ينطلق من مصالح الأوطان ومن سعة الأديان.
So for me, the approach has to be based on a dialogue that emanates from a serious dialogue that emanates from a desire for understanding, and then also looking at the shared interest. Thank you. Yeah, the shared interest. My brain's starting to fag
من
here.
سعة الأوطان واتساع الأديان.
And also from the broadness or vastness of these religious traditions.
أن نقول للشيعي يمكن أن تعيش دينك وللسني يمكن أن تعيش دينك.
So the Shia can live their way and the Sunni can live their way.
وبالتالي الحرب بين الشيعي والسني هذه حرب لن تنتهي. المخزون البشري كبير، مخزون السني كبير، عشرات الملايين، مخزون الشيعي كبير، فهي حرب لا فائدة منها.
So if we have war and if you look at the human resources in the Shia, amongst the Shia, the human resources among the Sunnis, these are endless. So if there's going to be war, it'll just be perpetual.
وبالتالي هذا لا مصلحة فيه للدين ولا للأوطان.
And in reality, there's no interest here, there's no benefit for either the religion or for the nation.
الانتصارات المحلية هي انتصارات وقتية.
So these so-called victories are temporary victories.
هنا نتكلم باسم العقل والسياسة وليس باسم الدين ربما.
He said now we're talking based on reason and political considerations, not really speaking from a religious perspective.
فنحن نقول للجميع لا مصلحة من هذه الحروب.
So we say there's no benefit in these wars. And just to add that, Shaykh Abdallah is really, for me, he's one of the unique people in Muslim religious leadership, in that he's been a minister, he's been vice president of a country, so he can see from both sides of the fence, which is unfortunately very rare, and it is an actual problem that we have amongst a lot of the religious leadership, is they really don't understand the difficulties involved in governance and the problems, especially with states that are either failing or have already failed.
ليس عند أحد وعد بأنه سينتصر.
So there's nobody has a guarantee that they're going to be victorious in these conditions.
هذا الذي نريد، المقاربة التي نريد أن نقولها للديانات المختلفة ولأهل المنطقة، يعني من يطرد المسيحيين السوريين هذا مجرم.
So this is the approach that we're taking to remind these people in the region. If you expel these Christians from your communities, you're criminals in doing so.
هذا هناك قبل الإسلام.
This is before Islam.
من 13 قرن لما أراد أحد الخلفاء أحد الحكام
1300 years ago,
المسيحيين من الجبال.
There was one of the rulers, Muslim rulers, wanted to remove Christians
رد عليه الإمام الأوزاعي من أكبر علماء
from the mountains in Lebanon, and Imam al-Awza'i, one of the great scholars of that period, prohibited, and he said you can't do that. And so he stopped. Yeah.
هذا يدل على أهمية التعاون بين رجال الدين وبين الحكام.
And this indicates, this story is a clear indication of the importance of the religious leadership to be involved in these decisions that can sometimes be
على
negative.
الحكام أن يعرفوا أنهم لا يمكن أن يحلوا مشكلة الحروب وحدهم.
So they need to understand, these rulers, that they can't solve these problems alone.
في الغرب أو في الشرق.
Either in the east or the west.
وأنهم لا بد أن يتعاونوا مع رجال الدين.
They have to engage the religious leadership.
انطلاقا من العقل ومن الأخلاق.
Emanating from both a rational point of view, but also a moral imperative.
وهذا التعاون ممكن.
And this is an engagement that's possible. It's a cooperation that can be
يجب أن
realized.
نبحث عن الأدوات والآليات.
So we need the tools and the measures that can be taken.
وأن نسير إلى الأمام إن شاء الله.
And to keep moving forward, progressing.
شكرا.
Thank you.
Vinya, do you want to say a last word?
The last question, it's about the Western government's engagement with religious leaders. I think in recent years there had been a lot of positive trends. We have seen institutions like the World Bank, the United Nations engaging in a very formal way. And there are networks like Religions for Peace. I think the lesson is that we need to rely on existing institutions and their enormous experience in engaging with the religious leaders. Sometimes these institutions really try to reinvent the wheel. I think that's not required. There is a knowledge base. There are tools that have been developed. So these governments can always rely on those experienced institutions, networks which have really supported the interreligious work and also promoted conflict resolution on the ground. Then on the last question about how best can you support those groups which are working under very difficult conditions, again it depends on the context. Different countries have very different conditions. They are again listening to those actors. What are the best ways in which you can support and strengthen without jeopardizing them. How certain policies of the same government can have different effects on the ground in those countries. I think those have to be carefully analyzed, and then this continuous engagement with the actors concerned, you can really come up with the best strategy. It's not straightforward to say this is how you should engage. I think we have to work it out very intelligently, assess the risks involved, and I think there have been progress made on those lines as well. We have generic lessons that we can learn from the countries that we have been working, and we have to further develop those tools, and then I think we can find the right answer.
And I would just say too that we had a very fruitful discussion with policymakers from the U.S. government this morning that was very frank and very open, and there was a lot of willingness expressed, not any reticence at all, except for a desire to ensure that the way in which the U.S. government and policymakers are supporting these religious actors doesn't undermine their legitimacy or their efforts or put them at risk. So friends, there's a lot of bad news in the media, but we know that that's not the whole story. There are also these good news stories of Buddhist monks in Myanmar who are opening up their monasteries to protect Muslims, of the Muslim communities who are speaking out in protection of the Christian communities who have lived in the Middle East forever. Let's keep, forever, for 2,000 years, let's keep telling these good stories. Let's share them on Facebook. Let's put them on YouTube. Let's share them with our friends. And on the way out, to help you do so, Shaykh Bin Bayyah has provided some party favors. He has a copy of the fatwa that he put out recently condemning ISIS and its violence, bringing up Islamic tenets and hadith and Quranic passages that challenge some of their notions, as well as his book, The Culture of Terrorism. So please join me in thanking very much our speakers for the work that they do and their reflections with us.